Here's a question that should bother you more than it does. It's August 1872. The Nebraska prairie is running at 103 degrees. Two men live half a mile apart. One of them has a root cellar, a hole dug into the earth, 6 feet down, roofed over with sod. The other has a proper above-ground pantry, well built, with ventilation gaps and a tight door. Both men put up the same supplies in June. By mid-August, the man with the pantry is eating rotted carrots and spoiled pork. The man with the hole in the ground is eating food that is still, somehow, nearly as fresh as the day he stored it. That's not a rhetorical question. It has a precise physical answer. And once you understand it, you'll never look at soil the same way again. Most people, if you ask them, would say the cellar stays cool because it's underground and underground is cold. That's not wrong, exactly. But it's not the answer either. It's like saying a river flows downhill because it's wet. Technically fine, practically useless. The real answer, the one that explains why 6 feet makes such a dramatic difference, why depth was everything, why the people who built these structures to certain specifications ate well while their neighbors went hungry. That answer runs straight through physics, through indigenous knowledge developed over centuries, and through some genuinely startling numbers about how fast bacteria multiply when they're happy and how slowly they move when they're not. We're going to work through all of it. There's also a second question sitting underneath the first one, and it's the more uncomfortable of the two. When the U.S. Army built forts across Dakota Territory in the 1860s, with engineers, with supply chains, with institutional resources that no individual settler could match, soldiers were still dying of scurvy from nutritional collapse, while indigenous villages a few miles away had been solving this exact problem for centuries. The Army eventually figured it out. The question is why it took them as long as it did, and what the people who already had the answer were doing differently. But start with this. In the summer of 1872, a man on the Nebraska prairie had a hole in the ground that was functionally closer to a modern refrigerator than to anything a 19th century engineer could have built above the surface. He didn't know the physics. He didn't need to. The earth did the work. The first question worth asking is the obvious one. Why did anything rot at all? Food doesn't rot on its own. That's the thing people miss. Rotting is not a passive process, not something that just happens when food sits around long enough. It's biological activity, bacteria and mold and yeast consuming organic material and producing waste products. The slime on old meat, the soft brown collapse of a potato, the white fuzz spreading across bread, all of that is life. Organisms eating your food. And like all living things, those organisms have preferences about temperature. Most of the bacteria responsible for food spoilage the common mesophiles, which is just a term for organisms that prefer moderate warmth, have their sweet spot somewhere between 68 and 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Salmonella, E. coli, the various Staphylococcus strains, they're all metabolically happiest in roughly the same range as a warm summer day. Below 41 degrees, most of them slow to a crawl. Below freezing, most stop entirely. But between 70 and 100 degrees, they double their population every 20 minutes. You put a piece of meat in a 95-degree summer pantry with 100 bacteria on it. 8 hours later, 8 hours, not days, you have roughly 17 billion of them. The math isn't subtle. It isn't gradual. It's geometric, relentless, and completely indifferent to whether you need that meat to last until October. And it doesn't stop at meat. A potato left in a warm, above-ground storage space in July didn't just sit there waiting. It was actively being consumed by organisms that had found the conditions ideal. Mold spores, Rhizopus stolonifer, the common black bread mold that also attacks soft fruits and vegetables, cannot grow at all below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Above 70 degrees, it colonizes aggressively. A carrot stored at 95 degrees with the wrong mold present could be unrecognizable in a week. This is the biological reality that every person on the frontier was living inside. The Great Plains in summer swung from about 65 degrees at night to over 100 degrees in the afternoon. An above-ground pantry tracked those swings almost exactly. The temperature in a wood frame building with ventilation gaps followed the outside air within an hour or two. So over the course of a summer day, your food spent the morning warming up, the afternoon baking, and the evening cooling, providing a near-perfect incubation cycle for every microorganism that had found its way onto the surface of your stores. Here's the thing about temperature cycling that makes it worse than simple heat. The cycling itself accelerates spoilage beyond what any single temperature would produce. Each time the temperature drops and rises again, it triggers waves of condensation on food surfaces, thin films of moisture that mold spores need to germinate. Organisms that might have stayed dormant at a stable temperature rouse themselves with each warming cycle. A piece of cheese kept at a steady 72 degrees will last longer than one that swings between 55 degrees at night and 92 degrees by noon. Stability matters as much as coldness. The prairie pantry had neither. Now hold that thought. The oscillation, the condensation, the 17 billion bacteria in 8 hours, and keep it in mind. Because the underground answer doesn't just cool things down. It kills the oscillation entirely, and that turns out to be at least half the solution. So, picture yourself as a settler deciding where to put your food supply in 1868. You've got beef, pork, potatoes, turnips, carrots, dried beans, whatever garden produce you can put up. You need it to last months, not days. You have no ice. The nearest ice house might be 50 miles away. You have no electricity, no tin cans, no mason jars if it's early enough in the settlement, no mechanical refrigeration of any kind. The answer that most settlers arrived at, the answer that common sense suggested, was to build a good pantry, ventilated, shaded, north-facing if possible, with thick walls. This was reasonable. This was what you'd naturally think of. This failed. The answer that worked, the answer that a small number of settlers arrived at, often by watching their neighbors struggle, sometimes by learning from indigenous communities who had solved this problem centuries earlier, was to go underground. 6 feet minimum, 8 if you could manage it, with a sod or earthen roof thick enough to matter, a north-facing entrance that minimized direct sun exposure, and a floor of packed earth, not wood. The settlers who understood this ate well through summers that rotted everything their neighbors had stored, and the reason why is sitting right under your feet. Soil is not just dirt. This seems like an obvious point until you start thinking about what soil actually does. It conducts heat, but slowly, extraordinarily slowly, compared to air or wood or metal. The thermal conductivity of typical dry prairie soil runs somewhere between 0.15 and 0.4 watts per meter per Kelvin. That's a number that won't mean much until you compare it to something. Steel conducts heat at about 50 watts per meter per Kelvin. Steel moves heat more than 100 times faster than dry soil. This means that when the surface of the ground reaches 103 degrees on an August afternoon, that heat does not simply sink into the earth. It seeps. The first few inches of soil warm up relatively quickly, following the surface temperature with some lag. But by the time you go down 2 feet, that lag is already measured in weeks. At 4 feet, you're looking at a 6-week delay before summer heat arrives. At 6 feet, where most effective root cellars lived, you're 8 weeks behind the surface, which means that in mid-August, the soil at 6 feet is still experiencing the temperature equivalent of early June. Early June in Nebraska, 6 feet down, is somewhere between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Not cold by refrigerator standards. But at 65 degrees, the mesophiles responsible for most food spoilage are operating at maybe 20% of their peak reproduction rate. At 55 degrees, closer to 10%. The food that would have grown 17 billion bacteria in 8 hours at 95 degrees will grow something closer to 200 million at 55 degrees. Still not ideal, but roughly 85 times slower. Across weeks and months, that difference is the gap between food that lasts until spring and food that's inedible by September. There's also something called thermal mass, which is separate from conductivity and just as important. High thermal mass means it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of a material. Packed soil has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 1 to 2.5 megajoules per cubic meter per degree Kelvin, depending on moisture content. In practical terms, even if heat is gradually seeping into a root cellar through that 6-foot soil ceiling, It has to change the temperature of an enormous mass of Earth to do it. The cellar resists. It buffers. The temperature swings that make above-ground storage so destructive become underground. Slow, gentle oscillations across months rather than hours. Here's a way to feel this, rather than just calculate it. Imagine you're the Earth around a root cellar. You're 6 feet of packed soil, and July arrives. The surface above you hits 103 degrees. A little of that heat starts moving downward toward you, but you are enormous. You weigh, per square foot of cellar ceiling, tens of thousands of pounds. To raise your temperature by even 1 degree, the summer has to push enough heat through you to warm every pound of that soil by 1 degree. That takes weeks of sustained surface heat. By the time enough energy has moved through you to raise the cellar temperature meaningfully, the season is already turning. At 10 feet deep, the annual temperature swing in a Nebraska root cellar narrowed to somewhere between 5 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit for the whole year, while the surface swung 80 or 90 degrees between January and July. That's not a hole in the ground. That's a different climate. But depth alone wasn't the full story. And this is where settlers who dug too shallow or in the wrong location found their cellars failing in ways they didn't expect. To understand why some cellars worked and others didn't, we have to go further back than the 1870s. We have to go to the Missouri River. The standard story about root cellars on the American frontier goes something like this. Settlers arrived. They were smart and industrious. They figured out that digging underground kept things cool. They built root cellars, and that's that. European ingenuity meeting a new landscape. But the real sequence is almost the reverse. When Lewis and Clark's expedition reached the Knife River villages in present-day North Dakota in the fall of 1804, they spent the winter there among the Mandan and Hidatsa people. What they found was one of the most sophisticated food storage systems on the continent. The Mandan had been farming the Missouri River bottomlands for centuries, growing corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers. And they weren't just growing it, they were storing it in quantities that would have fed entire army garrisons for months. Beneath those villages, the Mandan had constructed bell-shaped cache pits. The entrance was narrow, never more than about 2 feet 8 or 9 inches across, specifically to minimize surface exposure and reduce moisture infiltration. Below the narrow mouth, the pit expanded outward into a rounded chamber, something like a jug buried upside down. The floor was lined with dead willow sticks for drainage, then covered with 3 to 4 inches of a specific grass, not just any grass, but a particular bluish grass that grew near springs, a type the women had learned through repeated trials resisted mold better than any other lining material. A buffalo bull hide was placed hair-side up over the grass. Then the corn went in, methodically arranged. Braided ears stacked against the walls with husk ends facing outward to protect against moisture. Shelled corn filling the center, dried squash strings placed at the very center of the pile with corn surrounding them on all sides. This information comes directly from Buffalo Bird woman Maxidiwiak, a Hidatsa woman born around 1839, who described the entire process in precise detail to anthropologist Gilbert Livingston Wilson for his 1917 University of Minnesota dissertation. She wasn't describing something she'd heard about. She'd done it herself, hundreds of times. She knew which grass worked and which didn't, because she'd watched the wrong grass mold. She knew exactly how to arrange the corn to protect the most moisture-sensitive food, the squash with the most moisture-resilient food, the shelled corn acting as insulation around it. Buffalo Bird woman estimated that a large pit required 2 to 3 days of women's labor to properly prepare and fill. The Mandan village system as a whole held an estimated 70,000 bushels of stored food. That's not a survival buffer, that's a trading economy. Mandan corn was traded with Lakota, Crow, and Assiniboine peoples who had no agriculture of their own. When Lewis and Clark arrived and needed food, they traded blacksmith work, iron work the Mandan couldn't produce directly for corn drawn from those underground stores. Meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis was learning to build his own version, somewhat less elegantly. His journal entry of the 9th of June, 1805, written at the mouth of the Marias River in Montana, describes in careful detail the cache-building technique he'd picked up from French-Canadian engagés on the expedition men who had themselves learned it from the Knife River villagers. Lewis described a circular hole dug to 1 foot, then widened outward as it deepened, eventually reaching the shape of a kettle 6 or 7 feet down. The excavated earth had to be carried to running water and the evidence washed away, leaving no surface trace. The expedition built at least 4 major cache sites, and 2 of them failed. 1 collapsed, 1 flooded. The ones that worked well. The ones that failed did so because of site selection errors or inadequate waterproofing, mistakes that indigenous cache builders had resolved through centuries of trial and error that Lewis and his men hadn't had. The Pawnee, in what is now Nebraska, dug outdoor storage pits reaching 10 to 12 feet deep, deeper than most settler root cellars, deep enough to reach zones of truly minimal temperature variation where annual swings narrowed to almost nothing. These pits were concealed under sod when the Pawnee left for seasonal buffalo hunts, invisible to anyone who didn't already know they were there. So when a settler in 1868 Nebraska dug a root cellar and found that his food survived the summer, he was practicing a technology that the people who'd lived on that land for centuries had already refined to a high degree. He just usually didn't know that. Let's get more specific about what a good root cellar actually needed, because the details matter more than most people realize. Depth was the first variable, and the most obvious. But the relationship between depth and performance isn't linear, it curves. The first 4 feet of depth by a lot. You drop from surface temperatures that can exceed 100 degrees to underground temperatures in the 6.5 to 7.2 degree range. That's significant, but not enough on its own. The next 2 feet from 4 to 6 narrow the summer high to somewhere between 55 and 65 degrees, which is where most useful food preservation begins. Each additional foot of depth beyond 6 buys progressively smaller improvements in temperature stability, but gets harder to achieve with hand tools. The practical sweet spot for frontier root cellars was 6 to 8 feet deep enough to get into the zone of serious temperature buffering, shallow enough to be achievable in a week or 2 of hard digging with shovels and picks. The second critical variable was site. Slope was preferred over flat ground, not for mystical reasons, but for gravity drainage. Water in a root cellar was catastrophic. Standing water would destroy stored food, spike humidity beyond useful levels, and cause structural collapse. A hillside location allowed water to drain away naturally, keeping the cellar dry. Lewis and Clark's Marias River cache failed partly because they built it on ground that turned out to be less well-drained than it appeared. The Upper Portage cache was inundated by spring floodwaters and destroyed. The site selection had been wrong. The third variable was the floor. The instinct is to use a wood floor. It seems cleaner, more solid. But wood floors dried out the cellar, dropping humidity to levels where root vegetables shriveled within weeks. The frontier builders who understood what they were doing used packed earth or gravel floors for exactly one reason. Earth floors wicked moisture upward from the soil below, maintaining humidity in the 8.5 to 9.5% range that root vegetables actually needed. At that humidity level, the moisture pressure difference between a carrot's interior and the surrounding air was minimal, which meant the carrot barely transpired at all. It didn't shrivel. It didn't lose the water weight that made it edible. It just sat there, waiting. The fourth variable, and this is the one that most confuses people, was ventilation. You might think you'd want an airtight root cellar. Maximize the cold, minimize the intrusion of warm outside air. But airtight cellars failed, and they failed because of 2 invisible problems. The first is ethylene gas. Apples, pears, and several other fruits produce ethylene as they ripen, a plant hormone that triggers further ripening and senescence in any nearby produce sensitive to it. At concentrations as low as 0.1 parts per million, ethylene causes potatoes to break dormancy and sprout prematurely, consuming their stored starch and producing toxic glycoalkaloids. In an airtight cellar, ethylene from a barrel of apples would start the potatoes sprouting within weeks. The solution that experienced cellar operators arrived at empirically long before anyone understood the chemistry was to put apples near the exhaust vent at the highest point of the cellar, where ethylene-laden warm air would be drawn out, and to wrap individual apples in cloth or paper to slow the gas's diffusion. The second is that some CO2 buildup was actually useful. In an enclosed space, respiring produce naturally consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, creating what modern food science calls a modified atmosphere. Elevated CO2 at around 2 to 4% suppresses mold growth and slows respiration rates further. The root cellar was, without anyone understanding the mechanism, practicing a version of what commercial apple storage facilities do today with precise atmospheric control. But too much CO2 in a truly airtight space becomes dangerous to humans entering it. The proper design used a two-pipe ventilation system. One pipe installed low near the floor on the north-facing wall, drawing cool, fresh air in. One pipe installed at the ceiling height, drawing warm and CO2, rich air out. Dampers controlled both pipes so that farmers could open them on cool nights to draw down temperatures and close them during extreme cold to prevent freezing. When all four of these variables, depth, site, floor material, and ventilation were managed correctly, what the frontier farmer had was a space that held between 45 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, maintained 85 to 95% relative humidity, passively managed atmospheric composition, and did all of this with no moving parts, no fuel, and essentially no maintenance. Potatoes in that environment lasted 4 to 7 months. Carrots packed in damp sand lasted 4 to 6 months. Cabbage hung from the ceiling beams lasted 3 to 6 months. Apples stored near the exhaust vent, wrapped individually, lasted 2 to 7 months depending on variety. Turnips and rutabagas held 4 to 6 months easily. Horseradish, buried in the cellar floor itself, lasted up to a year. Above ground in August, Nebraska, most of those same vegetables would be gone in 1 to 3 weeks. We should talk about what happened when people got this wrong, not as a cautionary tale, but because the failures illuminate the physics better than the successes do. Zenas Leonard, who left St. Louis in April 1831 with a fur trapping company, wrote in his journal that they killed their last beef on June 21st, just 2 months out. The company captain, facing near mutiny from starving men, eventually ordered 2 of the best horses killed for food. Leonard later described crossing mountain passes with nothing to eat, with the exception of a few beaver skins that were chewed and swallowed because the alternative was dying. Rufus Sage, traveling the Rockies in the early 1840s, wrote about going 4 and 5 days at a stretch with nothing to eat at all. He consumed bald eagle, prairie dog, and something he called bilter's juice squeezed from buffalo intestines that made him vomit. He and the men he traveled with were not incompetent and not lazy. They were living the life that results from moving constantly, carrying everything you owned, having no permanent location to anchor a storage system to. The mobility that made trappers and mountain men successful hunters made permanent food storage impossible for them. These men didn't nearly starve because they were foolish. They did so because mobility and root cellars are incompatible technologies. The failures that are harder to look at are the institutional ones, the ones where people with resources and organizations still got it wrong. At Fort Rice, North Dakota, during the winter of 1867 to 1868, General Felipe Regis de Trobriand documented what happened when the U.S. Army tried to supply a remote frontier garrison without adequate food storage or fresh produce. 79 soldiers developed scurvy that winter, scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, a disease that had been understood and preventable for decades. The Army knew what caused it. They simply hadn't solved the logistics of keeping vitamin-bearing produce alive through a North Dakota winter in an above-ground structure. The Missouri River froze by early November, cutting off resupply by steamboat. The railroad hadn't reached northern Dakota Territory yet. Everything had to arrive during the brief summer navigation window and then survive the winter in whatever storehouses the fort had built, wood-frame structures that froze solid in December, partially thawed in a warm February spell, refroze in March. Each freeze-thaw cycle damaged cell walls in stored produce. Each warming period invited microbial activity. By February, a barrel of potatoes that had looked adequate in October was a fermenting, vitamin-depleted mass that soldiers ate anyway because there was nothing else. 79 cases of scurvy from a preventable disease in a garrison that was supposed to represent the organizational power of the United States government. The following year, O'Brien stocked the post with pickles, sauerkraut, and vinegar foods already chemically preserved that didn't rely on cold storage. Scurvy cases dropped to 5. By 1870, most Dakota military posts had finally built underground storehouses for vegetables. The Army had effectively reinvented, under pressure of disease and death, the same solution the Mandan and Hidatsa had been using for centuries, a few dozen miles up the same river. There's a surgeon's account from Fort Abercrombie in 1869 that's worth pausing on. The surgeon observed, with genuine puzzlement, that indigenous peoples living near the fort never developed scurvy, even in late winter, when he couldn't see where they were finding sources of vitamin C. He knew they ate wild fruits. He couldn't work out how they had enough of those fruits in March to prevent the disease. He never arrived at the answer in his account. Dried fruits and vegetables, stored underground since the previous summer, were still nutritionally viable months later. His patients, soldiers eating out of barrels stored above ground through a Dakota winter, were consuming food so degraded by temperature cycling, freezing and thawing, and bacterial breakdown that most of its nutritional value was already gone. The same winter, the same location, opposite outcomes. One group was eating stored food that worked. The other was eating stored food that didn't. Here is the biological reality that unites all of these stories. Lower temperature slows every biological process that destroys food, not in a linear way, but in an exponential way. Biochemists use something called the Q10 coefficient to describe this. For every 10 degrees Celsius you drop the temperature, biological reaction rates roughly halve or are cut by 2/3, depending on the reaction. For most mesophilic food spoilage bacteria, the Q10 is between 2 and 3. When you compare a prairie pantry at 95 degrees Fahrenheit to a root cellar at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, a gap of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 22 degrees Celsius, you're looking at a spoilage rate reduction of somewhere between 6 times and 16 times. The exact number depends on which organisms you're dealing with and what their specific temperature sensitivities are. But the range is consistently 6 to 16 times slower. Food that rots in 2 days at 95 degrees lasts 2 to 4 weeks at 55. At the scale of a summer from June to September is roughly 90 days. Food that gets 2 to 4 weeks of useful life above ground gets 4 to 12 months of useful life below. That's the difference between a family that eats in March and a family that buried someone in January. The humidity factor is almost as important and gets talked about far less. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, beets, potatoes, turnips are 75 to 90% water by weight. They're not sealed containers. They're permeable. When the humidity of the surrounding air drops below about 85%, they lose water to the air through transpiration, just as a plant loses water through its leaves. What you get is shriveled, leathery, unpalatable produce. The texture goes first, then the flavor, then the nutritional value. An above-ground pantry in Nebraska summer, even one with some moisture in the wood, ran at perhaps 30 to 50% relative humidity on dry days. A properly built earth-floored root cellar ran at 85 to 95%. The carrot in the pantry was shriveling. The carrot packed in damp sand in the cellar was sitting in an environment that gave it no reason to lose a single drop. And then there were the invisible gases, 2 of them that no frontier farmer understood chemically but that the successful ones managed empirically. The first was ethylene. Apples, pears, and several other ripening fruits produce ethylene gas, a plant hormone that triggers further ripening in ethylene-sensitive produce nearby. At concentrations as low as 0.1 parts per million, ethylene causes potatoes to break dormancy and begin sprouting, consuming stored starch and generating toxic glycoalkaloids. This is why a barrel of apples stored next to potatoes could render the whole potato supply inedible within weeks. The frontier farmers who figured this out, usually after watching it happen, once moved their apples to the highest point of the cellar, nearest the exhaust vent, and wrapped individual apples in cloth or newspaper to slow gas diffusion. They didn't know what ethylene was. They just knew apples ruined potatoes if they were too close, and they separated them. The second gas was carbon dioxide, and this one actually helped. Produce respires, it consumes oxygen and releases CO2, even after harvest. In a partially enclosed root cellar, this respiration gradually shifted the atmosphere away from the normal 21% oxygen and 0.04% carbon dioxide towards something with elevated CO2. At around 2 to 4%, CO2 suppresses mold growth directly, slows the produce's own respiration rate, and reduces ethylene production. The cellar was, without anyone naming the mechanism, practicing what modern food science calls modified atmosphere storage. Commercial apple warehouses today spend significant money achieving precisely these atmospheric conditions with mechanical systems. The root cellar achieved a rough version of it passively, as a side effect of being partially sealed with living produce inside. Too much sealing was its own problem. A truly airtight cellar built up CO2 fast enough to become dangerous to humans entering it, which is why the two-pipe ventilation system mattered so much. One intake pipe low on the north wall, one exhaust pipe at ceiling height. With dampers, the farmer could open on cool nights to pull down temperatures and close when outside air dropped to freezing. The system was passive, adjustable, and required no power beyond the judgment to know when to open and close two wooden dampers. Here's what all of this added up to in practice, in numbers that frontier families tracked through hard experience. Potatoes stored in darkness at 38 to 45 degrees lasted 4 to 7 months in a properly built root cellar, while the same potatoes in a warm above-ground pantry through a Nebraska summer began sprouting and turning toxic within 2 to 4 weeks. Carrots and parsnips packed in damp sand held 4 to 6 months underground, and above ground in August heat they shriveled and became inedible inside 2 weeks. Cabbage hung upside down from ceiling beams hung, not stacked on shelves, because stacking caused it to sweat and rot at the contact points lasted 3 to 6 months in cool humidity. Apples lasted 2 to 7 months depending on variety in a well-managed cellar, versus 1 to 3 weeks on a pantry shelf in summer. Horseradish, buried directly in the cellar's earth floor, lasted up to a year. Not every food worked this way. Ripe tomatoes lasted 5 to 10 days. Even in the best cellar conditions, their cell walls were too fragile, their water content too high, their respiration rate too fast. Summer squash lasted 2 weeks at most, soft berries just days. These were foods that had to be eaten fresh, preserved by canning or drying, or accepted as seasonal. The root cellar was not a space that preserved everything equally. It was a specific physical environment matched to the biological needs of specific kinds of produce, the dense, low moisture, slow respiring things that happened to be the same foods grown in quantity during a short prairie growing season and needed across a long prairie winter. The people who understood this were selective. They stored what worked, preserved otherwise what could be preserved, and accepted that some things simply couldn't be saved. That selectivity was itself a form of hard-won knowledge. Now, back to the man in August 1872 with the hole in the ground and the carrots that were still good. There was nothing magical about what he did. He found a slope, ideally a north-facing hillside where a bank cellar could be cut horizontally into the earth. He dug down 6 to 8 feet from the surface level of the hill, which meant he had 6 to 8 feet of earth above the cellar floor and earth pressing against 3 of the 4 walls. He left the floor as packed soil, maybe smoothed, maybe covered with gravel for drainage. He built shelves from rough lumber to keep produce off the floor and allow air circulation around stored items. He put a ventilation pipe near the floor on the north wall and another through the roof, and he built a door, probably double, 2 layers with an air gap between them, north-facing, so that no direct sun struck it during the warmest part of the day. The whole structure cost him a week's labor, and whatever rough lumber he could spare for shelves and the door frame, with no manufactured materials and no specialized knowledge beyond what he'd learned from observing which neighbor's food lasted and which didn't. Inside that cellar, the earth did the rest. The soil above and around him held temperatures in a range his pantry could never achieve. The massive thermal inertia of the earth, all those millions of pounds of soil that had to be warmed before the temperature could change, smoothed out every daily temperature swing, absorbing summer heat so gradually that the peak never arrived until the outdoor peak was already weeks past. The earth floor wicked moisture upward, keeping humidity high enough that his produce didn't shrivel. The passive airflow through his vent pipes managed CO2 accumulation and drew off ethylene. He didn't know the term mesophile. He didn't know what Q10 meant. He didn't need to. He had observed, or been told by someone who had observed, that food kept in the ground stayed edible, and food kept above it didn't. The Mandan women who lined their cache pits with spring grass, because they'd watched other grass mold, they hadn't run controlled experiments either. They'd done something more reliable. They'd paid close attention to what the earth was telling them over generations until the knowledge was precise and transmissible and demonstrably true. That's what empirical knowledge is. You don't need the equation to use the effect. Here are the numbers one more time, laid out plainly. Surface temperature on the Nebraska prairie in August ran 95 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature at 6 feet underground in August sat between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a gap of 35 to 50 degrees. That gap produced a spoilage rate reduction of 6 to 16 times slower. The daily temperature swing above ground ran 30 to 40 degrees from overnight low to afternoon high. The daily temperature swing at 6 feet underground was effectively zero. Humidity in an above-ground pantry in dry August ran 30 to 50%. Humidity in a properly built earth floor root cellar ran 85 to 95%. A potato in a warm pantry sprouted and became toxic in 2 to 4 weeks. A potato stored correctly in a root cellar lasted 4 to 7 months. An apple deteriorated at room temperature in 1 to 3 weeks. An apple stored near the exhaust vent of a proper root cellar in cool 4-5 degree air lasted 2 to 7 months. At Fort Rice, using above-ground storage in winter, 79 soldiers developed scurvy. The following year, using chemically preserved and underground stored produce, the number dropped to 5. These are the numbers. The physics is measurable and the history is documented. What strikes me working through this is how thoroughly we've managed to forget something that kept people alive. Root cellars aren't exotic. You've probably driven past dozens of them, the hillside door in a farm's north slope, now mostly decorative or used for lawn equipment. The knowledge of how to build one correctly and why the specifications matter has faded to near invisibility in the century and a half since the people who needed them urgently passed it on. The Mandan cache pits are a deeper loss. Buffalo Bird Woman's testimony, the precise description of which grass to use, how to arrange the corn around the squash, how wide to make the mouth of the pit, is preserved in a 1917 dissertation that most people have never heard of. The technology she described had kept people alive on the Missouri River for centuries. The army that built forts a few miles from those villages was getting scurvy in 1868 for want of a version of the same knowledge. There's something in that contrast worth sitting with. Two groups of people, the same winter, the same geography. One had solved the problem of keeping food viable across seasons through generations of careful observation and refined technique. The other had the resources, the engineering capacity, and the institutional authority, and was still burying soldiers from a preventable disease. It wasn't a knowledge failure exactly. It was a listening failure. The answer was right there, being practiced by people who'd worked it out long before anyone arrived with a survey compass. The food that stayed fresh in those underground pits, the corn that lasted through North Dakota winters, the turnips that came out of Nebraska hillsides in March, still firm and edible, that food survived because someone, generations back, had paid close enough attention to the earth to understand what it offered. 6 feet down, the bacteria slow to a fraction of their surface speed. The humidity holds. The temperature barely moves. The food waits. It waited then. It would wait now. That's what the Earth has always been willing to do. We just have to ask it the right way. Share project Contentman Montaigne created by Yuhao Mountain Men. Avoid these styles were used. TXT1, 43, line ST case T.